Want to be in the know on all things cannabis? You're in the right place. Regulations, growing, running the business.
I need $1.
Welcome to the $1 Pound Podcast. Here are your hosts, industry professionals Ryan and Joey.
Welcome to another episode of the $1 Pound Show. Today we have a very special guest. We have Norm Groot, who is the Executive Director for Monterey County Farm Bureau. Norm, why don't you kind of let people know who you are and exactly what is Farm Bureau, because a lot of our listeners don't know what Farm Bureau is.
Okay, I'll start with Farm Bureau, and thank you for having me today. Farm Bureau is an organization of family farms in Monterey County. This is our 100th anniversary this year, so we're going to have a big Centennial event to celebrate that. But we've been representing farmers and ranchers here in Monterey County. Originally started as a process to facilitate having farm agents from the UC Cooperative Extension System placed in our county. At the time, there was a legislative requirement that Farm Bureau had to have an office for the farm agent to be in. Gradually over time, as transportation improved and other circumstances, the farm agents didn't necessarily have to be in our offices anymore. And so we eventually consolidated everything to the Salinas area and now just have one office. We had 13 at one point throughout Monterey County. So that was not only the focal point for the farm agent, but also for a purpose of allowing farmers to come in and get education. We provided services such as banking and insurance at that time, and we still do to some degree now, but it's not a major part of what we do. And also for social, because in 1917, you couldn't drive from King City to Salinas the way you do now. So people had to have an area to which to gather. Over the years, and really starting in the 1970s when we started the acceleration of the vegetable crops, the strawberries, some of the other quick turning crops that we have here, Farm Bureau became much more of an advocacy organization for the farmers. And so now we are what we call the voice of the farmer, where we represent them at various different meetings throughout the county and with our legislators, our elected officials and regulators, as well as other interactions with the community, because agriculture is a big part of the community here in Monterey County. And so over the years, we've evolved, and now about 80% of our work is advocacy work on behalf of the family farms here in Monterey County. The other 20% is still education and services that we provide, as well as additional benefits. As far as I'm concerned, and my background is in horticulture, I worked for wholesale nurseries for the better part of my career before coming here to Farm Bureau, and grew plants first, mostly annuals and perennials in a smaller operation that covered a lot of the West Coast, and then most recently for Monrovia Growers, which is a big national horticultural company that grew 1,200 different varieties, and at any point in time had 23 million containers on the ground growing plants. So big operation with six locations across the country at one point in time. So my background is in agriculture, and I was a volunteer in Farm Bureau before I became the staff member here in Monterey County. So familiar with the operations. There's a Farm Bureau in 53 out of the 56 counties in California. It's unique to the United States, where we have actual offices in each county. And then we have a statewide federation that really handles a lot of the statewide issues, so to speak, and also looks at what goes on in Sacramento and the legislature there and advocates on our behalf. On top of that, there's an American Farm Bureau Federation that covers all 51 states, including Puerto Rico, and they interact with what goes on in Washington, D.C. for us. So Farm Bureau is really three levels, and it's really driven by the local boots on the ground, so to speak. That's where the policies come from. That's how we develop our agenda each year, so to speak, based on the issues that we have to face. And so it's really one of the true grassroots organizations for farming.
Wow. And how long have you been in this area in Monterey County?
I've been here about 6.5 years now, and came from Orange County, so that was a big change. I'm a native of Orange County, and quite honestly, I don't miss the traffic and the congestion and all the people. And I think one of the great things about Monterey County and the communities here is that everywhere you go, you run into someone you know.
Right. And
it really feels like a small town atmosphere, and so we really enjoyed that part of it. And getting to know a lot of the people here. Life is a little bit slower than Orange County, which is great. We're welcoming that. And obviously, we don't have to plan our lives around traffic patterns anymore.
Yeah, Ryan used to live down there, actually.
Oh, I hated the traffic. Don't even get me started on that. Oh,
It's
my
interesting
God.
when you go back down to the LA Basin and you come down off the Grapevine and suddenly there's 14 lanes of freeway and they're all stopped. It's like, really, how many people do we have here? So don't miss that at all. So Monterey is a great place to live, and we're really fortunate to be here.
Yeah. So obviously our show focuses on cannabis, and we have Monterey County NORML has become a member of Farm Bureau. I'm sure a couple other folks have. Do you have any idea how many cannabis operators have become members?
I think there's 6 now, and there's a 7th one that's supposed to be joining this week. So, so it's growing steadily and slowly, but we're certainly welcome of that commitment by those growers. And as you are probably aware, that we started with a policy on cannabis, supporting it as a agricultural crop already almost 2 years ago now. And so we were ahead of the curve on what the county was doing with their ordinance, and mainly so that we could be in that discussion.
Right.
And so we've been supportive of this process all along, ever since medicinal became really the focal point and legalized.
Yeah, and we encourage everybody that we run into to join Farm Bureau. A lot of times you'll have areas that have cannabis, that have had cannabis for a long time, and you end up having so many groups created that all basically want the same thing and do the same thing. And we were in a room with, I don't know, a dozen growers like 2 weeks ago, and they were talking about creating a new group. And we were like, you guys, we don't need to keep creating groups. You should just join Farm Bureau. And if we get enough members to join Farm Bureau, we can just do what's already working, something that's already established. We don't need to reinvent the wheel here.
Yeah, I've seen that too. I've had a couple of emails from various different groups that have been trying to form and wanting us to be a part of that type of association and be a liaison, so to speak. And I'm really encouraging them to say, let's work within the existing structures that we already have as associations and not reinvent the wheel, so to speak. Because we have a lot of connections, obviously, Farm Bureau being around for 100 years. We have a lot of fingers on the button, so to speak, already. And there's no need to go through a process of setting up a whole new organization and duplicate efforts and then trying to coordinate it with all the existing organizations, of which we have several already in Monterey County. So I think it behooves everyone to kind of stick to the game plan and use what's already there in place.
Yeah, it just makes a lot more sense. Speaking of Salinas Valley Ag, have you seen any major changes so far now that cannabis is becoming more accepted, or is it still kind of early to see those changes in your opinion? Or
I would characterize that as the acceptance level has gone up considerably in the last several years. I think as this process has developed and we've seen the professionalism of the cannabis growers, so to speak. I think everyone was worried in the beginning that it would just be a whole bunch of potheads coming together and trying to do a grow. I think we've really, gone a long ways in promoting the acceptance of this because of the professionalism that's been displayed so far, and the outreach, I think, between the two entities, so to speak, production, agriculture, and now cannabis, has been good because the communication levels have been very, very open and very forthright. And I think we've done a good job of working together as a community to fulfill all the concerns and needs. So I think the biggest change I would say is there's acceptance now on a broader scale. And then you still have people who are saying no. And really, I think you're not going to change those people's minds at this point. But I think for the broader prospect, and I look at this as really Salinas Valley has been early adopters of technology and new ways to do things and new crops all along. And so this just kind of fits into that whole process of accepting and moving forward and being progressive and looking at where we can expand our reach, so to speak, with the crops that we produce here. I mean, 150 different crops in one county is an amazing number. And to add cannabis and look at that as part of this process, I think is pretty phenomenal. So I think I would characterize it as the acceptance level has come up quite a bit. I mean, when it first started here, everyone was saying, no, we don't want that. We don't want them growing it outside. We're worried about security, all those things that have come up before. And now you don't hear that so much anymore, because I think the professionalism of what's been displayed so far has really quieted a lot of those concerns.
Yeah. And I would say that, the major change too, obviously, is these greenhouses are becoming a lot prettier than they used to be. Slowly.
That's an interesting point, because somebody was asking me about that yesterday in a meeting I was in, and I said, we've done a lot to remove blight from our environment because of this whole cannabis situation, and coming in and rebuilding some of those greenhouses that have been abandoned for decades almost because of the whole flower industry evaporating when it did. I think this has done a lot for our community in a lot of different ways, and one of them is removing all that blight. And so it's nice to see all those new greenhouse ranges and better structures and organization and not all the trash blowing around. So I think that's helped with the community acceptance also.
Yeah, definitely. And it's a perfect time to have Norm on. We didn't even really plan this, but the Forbes AG Tech Summit is here in Monterey County. And Ryan, you actually got to tour a cannabis facility this morning.
Yes. Group of Floor, they're friends of ours. They had a tour and they brought a bus in from all the people from the Ag Tech Summit that they could out to Moss Landing, which is the Moss Landing commercial zone. So it's actually on the coast as it is. So they got to see basically everything from how plants are grown from the nursery stage all the way through to how it's processed, how it's packaged, distribution. And they got I think probably an eye-opening experience for a lot of what they have out there. As far as concerns, though, in farming in general, now I've always believed, and I think you guys had the right philosophy to treat this as an ag crop because that's just is. I think it should have always been actually under the Ag Commissioner's control. But as it is right now, the government has many different fingers in it coming from many different departments, all centralized under one, but they're approaching it more from the alcohol distribution style model of how they look at these things. As far as an ag crop in general, what is the history, for example, with the lettuce, the leafy green growers originally, and then when the berry pickers came in, and recently there was the annual report for ag of how the state works. And there was a decline in the value of some of the crops here. And some people have speculated that's because of cannabis, even though cannabis wasn't taken into account as an actual ag crop being produced here. So right now, this county, what is it? It's like $4.5 billion on average. We supply something like 50% of the lettuce for the United States. How do you see cannabis being incorporated and actually truly monitored and regulated as an ag crop going forward? I don't think it's going to happen in 2-3 years, but maybe in 10, it could turn on like that and eventually, hopefully, transfer over to like an ag commissioner.
Sure. Well, let's address the crop report issue first. And we did announce yesterday that it's a 9% decline from the 2015 numbers, which was a peak year. And I think the understanding needs to be that 2015 was one of those years where everything came together. We had great weather, we had water, we had good crop yields, we had excellent market pricing. And so everything came together, and that's why we had such a great value in 2015. Now, when you look at 2016, there were much more market pressures from pricing. We saw a decline in 9 out of the top 10 crops because market prices were deflated from where they were in 2015. So the only impacts that I see from the cannabis perspective is really on the nursery sector, where you have greenhouses that are now in cannabis. We're no longer producing container stock or flowers, and maybe weren't producing anything because they were blight. But to look at it and say that the crop report declined because of cannabis, that's not going to be supported. It's really due to market fluctuations and pricing. And that's what we tried to stress yesterday at the press conference with the Ag Commissioner, is that, these are one of the risks that all farmers take, is that they have to have the right weather, they have to have pest-free situations, they have to have water, and they have to have the market pricing. And so what we saw between 20 and 15 was really a function of market pricing. Now, looking at 10 years out, I think there's going to be a stabilization or an equalization of how cannabis fits into that mold. And when it's ultimately declared an agricultural crop and the Ag Commissioner is then responsible for it, they're all ready to put it in the ag report and see where it fits into that. And if it makes the top 10 crops, that's great. That's more money for our county and more for our economy. And I think you'll see, as far as edging out other commodities, there's always changes in commodities of what we produce. I mean, if you look at the evolution over the 100 years of Farm Bureau, we have had tremendous change here in what we produce, going from basically cattle and confined animal operations and dairies to sugar beets, and now eventually into vegetable crops like leafy greens and the berries. And so we're constantly evolving, and I think cannabis is going to fit into that evolving picture on the next decade. And of course, there's going to be some market adjustments because of that. And we'll have to see how that fits in with the overall picture. But I don't think we're going to see that lettuce is going to completely disappear because of cannabis. We still have to eat. And we are the prime supplier, as you said, of lettuce throughout the country. And many times we're the only supplier of lettuce to the country because of weather. So I think it will equalize out, and there's a market share or a balance for all crops, including cannabis, and how much the market will tolerate. And so that supply and demand will really dictate what we grow.
Could you see, for example, this county not only supplies an extraordinary amount of food to the rest of the country, but we also trade with other countries in a big way. So I believe Canada, China, like Taiwan. I mean, there's a lot of countries that basically take a lot of our ag products. Someday, for example, the taxes have already started to be collected on these crops as it is for cannabis. I think the last quarter was like $700,000 is like a rough estimate is what we heard. With the tax rate that we have for cannabis as high as it is on a square footage side, and the point of sale getting a gross receipts hit. So it's $15 a square foot right now in this county for an indoor greenhouse. We can't do outdoor. And then at the point of sale, it's hit as well. In the middle, the distribution companies for like wholesale distribution, they're getting taxed at 5% as well. So you're very familiar with how regular wholesale distribution works for ag products. Do you think that's disproportionate or unfair or inefficient as a system to have like the wholesalers right in the middle getting taxed? Because it's a really tricky situation. We're in the kind of a play to pay or a pay to play sort of environment when it comes to cannabis. But the tax rate, as high as it is, that's going to be one of those components that actually deters people from coming to this county, as well as other places buying it in a big way. So how does it work with regular wholesale distribution for just regular ag products? Like, what's the breakdown of that?
Well, with the exception of wine grapes, there are no taxes at the distribution level, and there really are no taxes on ag products, period. I mean, it's considered a food product. It's a necessity of life. And so we have not gone down that road. And it seems that the model they're using is alcohol and the taxes that they put on all the various different levels of alcohol production. And interestingly enough here, I think some of the grape growers that we have in the area here are completely supportive of keeping the tax level either very low or none at all for cannabis, simply because they've seen what's happened to them in their industry and the different levels that they have to deal with and the complexity of the tax code, so to speak, for what they're doing in their crops and the taxation at the distribution level. And so one of the concerns I do hear from everyone, not just the grape growers at this point who've been vocal about the tax issue, is that if we keep such a high tax rate like we are now, we are going to drive potential production away, but we're also going to drive potential production underground again. And that's the last thing we want to do. If this cannabis sector is to move forward and become part of our economy here, it needs to be in the daylight, and we cannot tax it to death. So I think there needs to be some sort of adjustment there to understand that, yeah, governments need money, but this is not the end-all solution for filling their budgets, as I think some of them are looking at. And where's the balance? I think for us, the perspective is that it's an ag crop. It should be treated as an ag crop, and that means that you don't tax it. And so we would support in the long run that process takes place, and that the county and the state and all the other regulatory agencies that are going to ultimately be involved in this would say, okay, yeah, this is part of the agricultural community. It fulfills a need, maybe not as a food product entirely, but it does fulfill a need as far as basic human necessities. So in the long run, I hope that they will realize that driving this back underground or driving it away from Monterey County simply because we got a high tax rate is not productive.
I couldn't agree with you more.
Yeah.
When it comes to other states, do they tax their food at all, or is there just no tax on ag food for like the country?
Well, I'm not fully aware of what all 51 states are doing at this point, but I think we can characterize it as saying that food is not taxed in general. I mean, we do have sales tax on some processed items in some states, and just depends on how they do it. Each state is unique in that way, but I think overall the characterization is that we don't want to tax our food supply, that we want to make it affordable for everyone, whether you're at the bottom end of the income chain or at the top. And part of what we've done here in America with our food supply is we have a great bounty that's available to everyone at a very reasonable price, and it is the safest food supply in the world. And so why doesn't cannabis fit into that? It's an agricultural crop. It should be treated that way. Let's not tax it to death. And I think at the same time, look at what we're doing to the alcohol industry, and particularly grapes and wine production, and how much really are we all contributing in tax dollars to that particular crop? And where does that end up? So I think that's a broader discussion that we need to have. But I think in the relative terms of cannabis, I think we better be very careful that we don't tax it back underground.
Well, aside from taxes, here's another dirty word: pesticides. The pesticides in our county. I mean, let's face it, we've put a lot into the soil over the decades here. It's an interesting scenario where basically, for example, we will have these grows in positive pressure greenhouses, trying to make sure the air doesn't come in and the floors are cleaned, and there's no touching of the dirt. Honestly, when it gets down to it, the pesticide levels for regular ag food, and I don't want to throw you under the bus on this as it is, but do you feel that the amount of pesticides we're currently using just for our regular food is too much and unnecessary? Or is this how you stop crop loss? Because at the same time, when we have cannabis, the pesticide levels that the state came down for us, some growers consider it very harsh. Others say it should be completely pure and free. But then, of course, you have an incredibly high rate of crop loss if you do that. So how much, like just for an example, how much of the Salinas Valley floor is actually percent-wise, just rough guess, organic farmland?
Good question, and that's a debate that we're all having amongst conventional and organic farming at this point, as pesticides is a huge hot topic right now. Right now, I would estimate that organic is about 30% of our production land. That doesn't translate into 30% of our values each year, because there's different yields and different things that go into that. But 30% of our land has been certified as organic, and it continues to increase each year. And we did see another increase this last year. So the fallacy that everyone misunderstands is that organic is not pesticide free. It uses organic pesticides, and sometimes those are not as effective as what is being used in conventional agriculture, simply because they're older, they're broader scope materials, they require more applications to be effective. And so in some cases, you may be putting more pesticides into the environment versus conventional if you're using organic pesticides. Now, that's not the case for everything, and that varies from crop to crop, obviously. But I think when it comes down to conventional farming and the use of pesticides, and those are really much softer chemicals than we were using even 15 years ago because of the development and the specific targeted pests that some of these are necessarily going after now. It's on a need to use basis. Pesticides are not cheap. I mean, a lot of them are petroleum based, so that makes them very expensive. And you're not going to find a farmer who's just going to go out and indiscriminately spray something simply because he thinks he needs to. There's got to be a reason to do it, because it's an input and a cost of production. So when it comes to the discussion of pesticides, first of all, I think you understand that California is the most heavily regulated state in the country as far as pesticides and the use of ag chemicals. And so we don't have as many as what's certified for the other 49 or broader scope states, simply because we have our own EPA system here in California. So when it comes to pesticide use, I think it needs to be, first of all, a toolbox that everyone has choices for and can use different things in situations, so that we don't build tolerances against an individual pest using simply one chemical. And second, it's got to be certified for pests that are working on cannabis too. I mean, we all clearly see a need to make sure that our environment where we're producing our crops is clean and disease and pest free. The market doesn't accept right now product that's less than perfect. And so the consumer is really driving that situation. So when they see an apple with a blemish in the market, they're not going to buy it. So we got to have a way to manage that to satisfy the consumer's need. And so they're really kind of driving the whole use of pesticides in agriculture. So when it comes to cannabis, I think there's a complete deficit there as to the tools and the toolbox that growers can use to protect their product, whether it's even the difference between conventional or organic use, if you want to call it that. And so I think it's important that we as a state realize that, we do have pests, and a lot of them are exotics that are introduced by mail or other sources that we really have no control over because we're a global market. And now to understand that we may have additional problems because of a new crop like cannabis coming in that has specific pests and diseases too. We need to understand that, and we need to understand how to protect it and make sure that the quality of the product is there. And so it's a tough balance. And I know it becomes a very emotional issue for a lot of people, and pesticides, particularly if you're using them near schools, and that's been a hot button issue. But I think we need to look at the safety record of what we've done here in California in the last 2 decades and how we've used chemicals, and that there haven't been broader based exposures to specific sets of humans, so to speak, because we're using it in a safe manner, and that farmers are being diligent. After all, their kids go to those schools, so they need to be safe. And so that includes cannabis. And I think cannabis needs to be recognized as one of those crops where applications may be necessary.
Yeah, and cannabis is in a weird spot because there's not a whole lot of research here done in America on pesticides and cannabis. And cannabis is incinerated in some ways, right? Depending on how people consume it. So we don't fully know what happens if it has pesticides on it and then you burn it and then inhale that. That's where it's in a tricky spot. And so we're regulating something, and we don't even really have the research to know how to regulate it. So we're literally figuring it out as we go with cannabis.
Yeah, and that is an interesting point, but it also fits with all the other things that are going on in agriculture too. For other crops, there's very little research that's being done on other chemicals for other crops too, simply because it's very expensive to do that research.
Right.
And then there's no guarantee that you're going to register the product for a particular crop or for a particular pest because of the regulatory process that they have to go through to get those approvals. And it's a long process. It's not simply let's get it in a year.
Right.
It's a much longer process. So cannabis is kind of behind the same 8 ball that agriculture is right now, that we're running out of tools in the toolbox because some of them have either been banned or are no longer useful. And we're not developing new ones. We're not looking at the opportunities for research in those areas. And cannabis absolutely is a prime example of that, where we don't have good research and we need to get on board with that.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about, before we started recording, me and you were talking about, I think it was grapes. You mentioned that became the new hot crop of Monterey County. And kind of explain how that happened and what happened with the price and the market.
Sure. I think we were talking a little bit about that yesterday at the crop report, and there is a new video on the Ag Commissioner's website that actually kind of goes through this process of how grapes were established here. And that goes back to the late 60s and early 70s, where you had some pioneers who decided that they were going to try some grapes on the Santa Lucia highlands and planted and found out that it worked and that they were able to produce crops here. And at the same time, you had other areas of California that were developing rapidly in vineyards. And so suddenly there was this large overproduction of wine grapes, and the market had to stabilize somehow. And so that meant there was a shakeout of some of the vineyards that probably didn't survive or were consolidated. And everyone kind of came to an equalization point of what the market would bear. And so there was a time of oversupply and depressed prices, so to speak, for wine grapes at that particular zenith. But here in Monterey County, they've done a really good job of figuring out which varieties fit best in the AVAs, the viticulture areas, and how successful they can be. So like Pinot Noir along the Santa Lucia benches is really recognized now as one of the finer varieties to grow here, simply because of the way it can be translated into wine and the taste. So it took a long time. I mean, that's 30 or 40 years of experience that have been developed, and I hope cannabis doesn't have to last 30 or 40 years before we get to that point. But the point being is that the market had to stabilize,
right,
because of all that overproduction. And it wasn't just what happened here in Monterey, but you had Napa, you had other areas in Central Valley, you had Temecula in Southern California, all booming at the same time. And suddenly you had this zenith of all these wine grapes available, and there just wasn't enough to support it. So there's an equalization that has to take place in the economy, and supply and demand should sort that out. That
Right.
should not be something that government comes in and says, you're going to only produce X.
Right. And that's something we talk about all the time, about the price of cannabis and what's going to happen, overproduction. especially considering it's obviously not fully accepted in all states yet. So we can't exactly, export it out of the state. So it's like, what are you going to do when all these areas are growing all that cannabis and they have to stay within the state lines? It's going to be very, very tricky.
Honestly, the answer is black market. We won't be able to control that. The people are going to do what they've been doing so far as it is. So everybody's rushing to grow as much weed as they possibly can. And that equalization, that's I hear crash. I mean, that's what's coming up. Here's another weird scenario and question. The amount that we pay the average worker in the field to work in a regular ag crop, I remember somebody mentioning that when strawberries came in and the berry pickers arrived, they got not the warmest welcome necessarily from the leafy green growers. I may be getting this incorrect, but basically it's because it was a seasonal crop and they would basically take their workers and they would pay them a little bit more. And that meant that the actual regular leafy green growers had to pay their workers more just to compete, just to get them back in there to do that. Now with cannabis coming in, do you see a similar scenario of that happening where basically the cost of production of food is going to go up simply because you're going to have to pay people more to pick it? And that's because the cannabis growers are paying their people equivalent or more, just taking more of the workforce away.
Well, that gets to the competition that has been ongoing in agriculture for many decades, and it's not just strawberries and lettuce. I mean, everyone's been competing for workers for multiple decades now, and we've had labor shortages throughout California for a long time. And so everyone is competing for the same worker, and strawberries for a while, they were paying more, and they probably are still paying more on a piece rate per basis, and others have had to match that and do it. But you're looking at a shrinking labor supply at this point because of our immigration policies and our failure on a national level to deal with comprehensive reform. And this goes all the way back to the late 1980s when IRCA was enacted, and we failed to finish the act. We didn't deal with all those people who wanted to come here and work. And so that's how we ended up with 12 million people who are undocumented at this point, and we haven't dealt with it. And so we're competing within each other to keep these workers online. And yes, wage inflation is considerably happening at this point. I think you also have to look at what California did with the minimum wage last year, and we're going to look at increasing that to $15 an hour by 2021 for a lot of the employers. So that's a huge increase in a very short period of time, and that's got to have impacts on the market value of the crops that we're growing. Otherwise, everyone's going to fail. Mm-hmm. I mean, we can't continue to grow and sell at the prices we're selling now and pay that rate. And one of the other myths, too, is that agriculture only pays minimum wage. Well, that's not true. We pay well above minimum wage, and particularly here in this valley, too, where we're competing for 45,000 people we need every year to harvest our crops. And so those wages, I think when you look at them, are much higher than the $15 rate already now. And so when you ratchet that up, you're competing. And yes, there's been a little discussion that cannabis may take away a few workers here and there, and that may or may not happen. And I'm not sure that fits any differently than the competition between all the other crops. I mean, we're going to continuously go down that road. I mean, a few weeks ago, we had a kind of a work stoppage action against one of the major processors here, and that caused a ripple effect throughout all the valley. And so everyone has to adjust as we go along.
As a regular ag crop.
Yes, that was a regular ag crop. So everyone's going to adjust as we go. And we figured it out so far, but I think the bigger challenge is going to be meeting that huge jump in the minimum wage and where the equalization is for all the other crops involved, including cannabis. The other factor it's going to drive is mechanization. And we're looking at how we can mechanize harvesting for lettuce, spinach, cauliflower, broccoli, strawberries, all those crops which are hand harvested now. And it's very difficult to do. It's technically very challenging. And that helps with having the Ag Tech Summit here this week, is that we can focus some of those innovators on what we're doing here on our specialty crops, as well as some of the other areas of California that really need help with this whole labor supply issue. So mechanization is going to come. And ultimately, if we can't afford the labor and we don't have mechanization, then there's going to be a wholesale change in the crops that we grow. and we will start growing more that can be harvested mechanically. And that may mean we go back to more grain crops that we were growing here 80 years ago. So we'll see how that all balances out. But labor is going to be one of those pressure points. And I wouldn't necessarily characterize it that cannabis is cannibalizing the current workforce. There's an equalization within all of that. And so it'll all work itself out, I think, in the long run. We're all competing for the same hands, so to speak.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and cannabis is interesting in the fact that we're still kind of trying to become accepted. And so you see things like in the city of Salinas, you got extra points if you were going to pay your workers 200% above minimum wage, which affects things greatly, obviously. So it's kind of balancing everything you said, and then also the fact that we're kind of trying to be accepted, so we're going above and beyond and doing certain things that maybe normal businesses wouldn't do for economic reasons, but we do for social reasons.
Well, and then I think that goes back to the main challenge that the smaller operations are going to have. If they have to pay 200% of the minimum wage, I mean, that's a huge leap. And if you're a small operation, you don't have that margin to play with. That's going to be your profit, so to speak. And if you don't make profit, you don't stay in business. So we're essentially saying we're squeezing out those small operators, and all the surveys say we want to keep the small farms. That's what the consumer keeps saying over and over and over. And I'm sure it would be true for cannabis too, if that's mixed into the surveys, but we're squeezing them out. And so there's consolidation that takes place. The big keep getting bigger, and they keep absorbing the smaller farms, and pretty soon you're not going to have those smaller farms anymore, and it's going to be more of the larger scale farming. And we're fortunate here in Monterey County that we don't have a whole lot of that. We do have some large operations, but considering what goes on in the Midwest and some of the large scale farming there, we're still small. But if we squeeze out those small 100, 200 acre farms, that they can no longer be viable. And I would think that's true for cannabis too, that if you're in a certain size of operation, you're no longer viable if you have to pay 200% over minimum wage. That's going to impact the value. And then you talk about market crash and nobody makes money.
Right. And that's the big topic in cannabis is the small farmer is terrified that they are going to be completely wiped out by big business, which is kind of already happening here in Monterey County with how much money is coming in. And I mean, properties now are being sold for $5 to $6 to $10 million, which is insane. Some of these people originally got these properties for like $800,000. So to see that is what's really scaring a lot of these smaller farmers.
Yeah, and we had a interesting discussion on land values earlier this week, and something else that I was involved in, and the availability of land that we have here in the Salinas Valley, which is essentially zero. I mean, we had some greenhouses; they've been all pretty much taken over and sucked up, so to speak. There is no open farmland that is available at this point. It's been in family generations for multiple generations. And if they're not farming it themselves, they're leasing it out. So there really is a finite amount of land that we have here. And so to balance all of that and then say you're adding a horrendous land value on top of it by acquiring a greenhouse for $5 or $6 million over an $800,000 value, that just makes everybody else's land values go up too.
Right.
And so you see that we have acreage here that's producing agriculture in the neighborhood of $80,000 to $100,000 an acre for open land, and that's completely unheard of the rest of the country. So we don't have a whole lot of land that we can play with here. And it's going to be very difficult to see how that all gets managed in the future and the pressure points that start developing as we have to pay 200% for over minimum wage, and we have market crashes in various different crops. And like we talked about earlier with the crop report, with a 9% deflation, so to speak, on the value of what we're selling. So all of those play into the mix, and eventually we're going to have to figure out how we're going to make all that work.
Yeah, I agree.
It sounds extraordinarily complex. When I was at the Moss Landing earlier today, I was talking to a gentleman who was very, very smart about how things work in the county, because he actually works for the county. His name's Chris Lopez. He knows what's going on.
I know Chris.
As far as I was asking him the structure of commissions, how they work, he actually brought up that some of the ag commissions, the way that they work, if you join, like the commissioners tend to work for free, the county will actually have to pay 2 analysts on average, and they get a salary like $75,000, but after benefits and everything, each one's about $150,000. And so to have 2 of them would be about $300,000 a year on average to do this. Last quarter for the cannabis taxes, as it is, $700,000. He said basically wait until there's about 4 quarters of taxes that have gone through, and then you bring it up as a public comment. You have it added to the ad hoc agenda and actually form a commission. Do you serve or work on any of the commissions in any capacity so far for the ag in this county by any chance?
Not really, no. And we have an advisory committee that reviews on a monthly basis some of the bigger issues that are brought to them either by the Planning Commission or RMA or any of the other county departments, environmental health. And that's more boots on the ground, so to speak, farmers and ranchers and people who are actually involved in direct agricultural production. As an association staff member, so to speak, I probably would not be the best voice on those because I have too many divided loyalties, so to speak, because I have to satisfy all my members when I do things.
Right.
And so it becomes a little different. But that brings up a good point in that I'll use the example that we just recently went through where the state mandated that we had to create a groundwater sustainability agency for the satisfaction of managing our groundwater basin. And we're looking at $1 million budget for a new agency that has to be funded, has to have staff members, and they're going to be in the range of the prices that you just quoted. And where's that money going to come from? The county's not going to be able to afford that on their own. Their budget's already tight. So that means we're going to assess either wellhead owners, or we're going to assess water use, or we're going to do something to generate that $1 million a year needed for this budget. And so bureaucracy keeps growing, and it has to be funded. And that means more taxes or more fees or more assessments. And we really need to look at where the most efficient use of those monies are. And when we get handed a state mandate like this one, we don't have a choice. It's an unfunded mandate, and we have to deal with it. But I think on a local level, on a county level, we can look at some of those things and say, is it duplicative? Are we really solving a problem? Are we really doing something that makes sense? If we ultimately get to a cannabis commission, we'd have to really see how that's justified and really if it's useful. And I think there's many people in agriculture are saying right now, we don't need any more government. We are so heavily regulated as it is. We don't need any more government, especially on a local level when we've got a state who's trying to manage everything on a one-size-fits-all basis. So I don't participate in commissions directly. I go to a lot of those meetings and I do make comments about it. But I think overall, we've got to be careful about how we grow government and really what the size of our local government is going to be.
I'd say it's a little bit out of control as it is right now.
Exactly. And to blindly propose another commission without really going through a study and understanding what is that commission going to accomplish? Is it just another bureaucracy to run regulatory systems through? We already got that. We don't need to go that road. If there's bigger policy decisions that need to be made, like the Ag Advisory Committee, then maybe that's where we do it.
Well, I would think it would just be so much easier, like if we could just let Ag Commission deal with cannabis, just let them do it. It's an ag crop itself. It just makes more sense. It's logistically, it's the most elegant solution.
Supportive of making that a regular ag crop. Let the Ag Commissioner do it. They've got a great structure there. They're very supportive of this process and the whole cannabis situation. I think that would be great, and that's what we support as we go along.
All right. I got another crazy question. When it comes to water, the cannabis industry quite often gets beaten up there were people blaming us for the drought that happened last year. So, it's a little bit absurd of how far they will go. To my understanding from the studies I've seen, for example, almonds are huge consumers of water when they're growing that. Grapes is like 2 to 3 times as much water as what we're using. The types of grows that we do here with how stringent the controls are on us for our water management for crops. And we're using pulse irrigation systems that have virtually no runoff. As far as cattle, you also represent the ranchers in this area as well. They use an extraordinary amount of water, but a cow takes like 5 years to get to the point where you actually use it. So you could actually break it up over 5 years to break it down and figure out what it really is. How does this area deal with water in general for ag? Like, how do you guys handle that? Because
so this podcast is only an hour, right? How long do we have? No, and I think what you're getting at is water use by crop, and without context, it's hard to understand that. And I think there's a lot of misconception because that context is not added to it. So for grapes, as you mentioned, yeah, grapes use water just like any other crop, but 95% of our grapes are grown on drip irrigation here. So we're not flood irrigating. We're not using overhead sprinklers. We are using the most efficient technology there possible to deliver the water where it's needed. And so grapes are very efficient, actually, the way we do it right now, as are a lot of other crops. We grow 65% of our crops on drip irrigation here. So it's again, because we have an early adopter community who saw the need to conserve water. And I go back to the quote that was given to me already a couple years ago, is that we are using 12% less water than we used 25 years ago and growing 45% more crops. So that dictates the amount of efficiency that we're already using. Now, we are also lucky here in Monterey County that we have our own water resource. We have 2 reservoirs at the south end of our county. We have 12,000 acres of recycled water, irrigated lands on the coastal zone. We have a Salinas River water project and a Salinas River diversion project, all contributing to keeping our resources in place. And so our groundwater basin is very resilient. We've done a good job of managing it over the years, where as we're extracting for the purposes of irrigation, we are actually percolating back in because we're releasing from the reservoirs to compensate for that. And so we're not that far off from sustainability. So when people look at the Salinas Valley and see, yeah, we're growing lettuce and strawberries and grapes, all things that take water, we're actually doing a very efficient job with it, and we're managing those resources so we can use them again. So when you talk about drought, and believe me, cannabis was not the only crop blamed for drought. There was a cycle there where every week I was getting calls from the media. It was almonds, it was lettuce, it was strawberries, it was then broccoli, for all things. Every crop got targeted simply because it was crop of the week. And I think it's unfair to characterize our food supply as wasting water, because it's a value add. We're putting water into a product that people consume. And so it's a value add. So whatever water we use to produce food or other products, cotton for our clothes, cannabis for our medicinal purposes, all those things are important for use of water. And that's why agriculture is a beneficial use of water in California and will remain so as long as we're producing food.
How long do you think it might be before Monterey is completely self-sufficient when it comes to water?
We really are almost there. I mean, we don't import water from any other area. We don't get any water from the Central Valley projects. We are completely dependent on what we have in our groundwater basin right now. Pretty much, we don't have surface water diversions on our rivers at this point, other than the Arroyo Seco. And so we do have a reliance on our own system. And so building those 2 reservoirs was a huge foresight on generations ago in the 50s and 60s, where they saw that we needed to recharge our basin. And yes, we still have a saltwater intrusion problem, but we're solving it. And we actually are seeing some progress there because of these projects. But the point being is that those 2 reservoirs have done a great job of recharging our basin, partly because we have a shallow aquifer and partly because we have sandy soil that allows it to percolate quickly. And so when we got rain this last winter, you saw all those wells, so to speak, rise again to where they normally are. And the impacts of whatever impacts we saw of the drought, which were very regionalized and very localized, came back right away. So we are very resilient and very self-sufficient already.
Is a lot of that just because we know that water is so valuable? Is the government forcing you guys to do any water conservation, or is that just the farmers doing it because they know it's the right thing to do?
I think here it's because we knew it was the right thing to do. I mean, the ag community and the landowners all came together and built those reservoirs. They built all the projects and paid for them themselves. It was not government money doing this, so to speak. Wow. And so we are still paying for it, and we will continue to pay for it because it benefits everyone. And so, yeah, it was a lot of foresight on the part of generations ago, seeing that, we have great possibilities for developing our resources here because we have a fairly resilient system if it's managed the right way. And yes, it's highly modified and we get criticized for that, but you have to look at the benefits too. 220,000 acres of irrigated land producing crops that end up on everyone's dinner table every night. Amazing. Right. Yeah. Absolutely amazing. And that we're able to sustain that every year, even in a drought where other parts were fallowing land, we didn't because we were managing it properly.
That's really impressive. And then the reason I ask is because Monterey County, if you're applying for a permit for cannabis in the county, we have to have water conservation measures in our application. We have to have something where we're conserving water. Some people are watering their plants and then taking the runoff out the bottom of the pot and cleaning that to be reuse it again. Like Ryan said, some folks don't really have much runoff at all. So it's been kind of an interesting topic in the cannabis community here. Like, what do you guys want us to do? Asking the county, like, what do you want exactly? You know?
Well, and I think that's coming for other crops too. I think the intervention there is a lot of the food safety measures don't allow the reuse of water on crops currently. It's a very complicated process. But we're getting to the point where we may be able to modify that. But we're also facing regulatory situations where we may be told how much nitrogen we can apply, and then that leads to how much water we can apply per crop. And so those conservation efforts, I think, if they're forced, are pretty darn dangerous. I mean, they're telling people essentially how to grow a crop, and they don't know the soil type, they don't know the weather, they don't know the climate. All those variables that come into growing a crop can't be in a one-size-fits-all situation. So if ultimately they decide lettuce can have X amount of water to grow a 9 or 10 week crop, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get an end product. So I think we run the risk of running down a really dangerous road by dictating conservation measures. The market should decide that. And as we've seen here, we're early adopters to the technology. If it's viable, people are going to use it because it sets them off in a differentiation where they can say, my product's more sustainable than somebody else's.
Right. And then speaking on the technology, that's something we talked about before we started recording too, is maybe cannabis, because it's a little more technologically advanced as far as how we grow, could influence ag, which is really what the Forbes AG Tech Summit is about, is taking the technology, applying it to ag. Because what ag has here in Monterey County is they know scale. They know how to grow massive amounts of crops, which cannabis doesn't really know. We're learning how to do that. We're learning how to scale. But cannabis has a lot more technology than traditional ag. So seeing that kind of come together through the Forbes AG Tech Summit, or just through the natural progression of this, is going to be very interesting to see how that affects the regular ag here in Monterey County.
And I think that's a great statement to make, because I think it does challenge everyone else to go to the next level as they see technology applied in one sector or another. It does spur innovation, and it does spur people to start thinking about how they can be more efficient in their operations, and maybe get them to take a look at something that may be different that's not already on their radar, so to speak. So yeah, I think this is great to have this in our own community here, where we have all these innovators coming from around the world who can take a look at what we do, see the wide variety of different crops that we grow and how we rotate through our valley on the different soils, and understand how they can help us. And there's a lot of great ideas out there and a lot of things that can be used. And I think cannabis, being as sophisticated as it is right now, if I could call it that, technologically more advanced, and as I said earlier, professional in the way they're doing it, there's a lot to be learned there. And it goes also along with what we've seen in the nursery area too, where computerized systems have helped control nursery stock climates, so that you don't have to have someone running around turning on a valve or closing a greenhouse or something, that you can do it from an iPad in your office. Yeah. And that's what we're all getting to, hopefully, is that we have people who are managing complete systems rather than running around from field to field doing it on a whim, so to speak, or sticking their finger in the air.
Right.
So yeah, there's a lot to be learned there. And I think we can all learn from each other. And I think that's the great thing about bringing a new crop into the mix, so to speak, is that there's a lot of great ideas that come out of that. And because we're at the level where people are starting to accept this more, I think the sharing will be a lot easier than in the past, where you've had crops come in and people feel they're being invaded. I don't think that's the case anymore.
Yeah. And it's interesting too when we talk about technology, because another thing that the county is wanting us to do, if we're doing an indoor grow, we have to have at least 50% of our energy coming from an alternative or renewable source, which on one hand, I understand why they want that. On the other hand, it's like, how are you going to mandate that when we're just getting started and we're just an emerging industry, at least a regulated emerging industry? And then one of our arguments was when they were creating the ordinance was, well, what if we just allowed outdoor grows? That would probably help offset the power consumption, right? So it's going to be interesting to see when we'll actually have outdoor grows allowed in Monterey County, which really is crazy to me that you can't grow outside when it comes to cannabis. It kind of blows my mind that that's not allowed.
I think we'll get to that discussion, and I think we're going to have that pretty soon. So I'm hoping that comes up as a topic pretty soon, because I agree. I think we need to deal with that at some point because there are a lot of inequities there. And this whole green energy discussion is great to have, but mandating it like that is very costly. And I'm not sure we have the right ordinances or processes in place, nor the ability to connect to the grid as much as everyone thinks we have. There's a lot of obstacles to putting up a solar facility, so to speak. There's
Right.
a lot of obstacles because nobody wants to see a wind machine in their backyard, those types of things. And so we're working through that. But I think to mandate it through part of an ordinance is really not allowing the market to decide it, because the market's going to dictate where the energy comes from. And if it becomes too expensive to buy it off the normal grid, then we're going to support alternative energy. And I think we've seen some of those things work. How we do it with the new formation of our community generation system that we're working on, and they're working on a lot of alternative energy solutions that they're going to buy for this particular area. That brings up land use issues. And how are we going to manage all those facilities? I mean, solar facilities take land.
Right.
And wind is something that we probably can manage, but we have to also look at the view shed and how that impacts that. Mm-hmm. So there's ways of doing things, but I'm not sure that the whole ordinance structure really supports what we're trying to get to as a solution.
Right.
I have jumping back to one of the questions actually about labor. What, or does the Farm Bureau have a possible solutions or things they want to see implemented as far as immigration reform that would make sense for this area? Or is that I know we don't have much time for that, but
real quick, I can say, we've been members of a coalition nationally for 15 years of 200 different organizations on a business and agricultural level, pushing for comprehensive reform, a temporary or guest worker program that works for California specialty crops that allows people to go across the border at will, and also a pathway for those people who are here who don't have documentation. And so we've been pushing for that for years and years and years, and we have come close sometimes. But I think now what I would characterize as the whole discussion now that is coming out of Washington, D.C. because of the rhetoric and all the things that the Trump administration has thrown into the discussion, it's great. Let's talk about it some more. Let's get it in the forefront, and maybe we can finally build a nexus within Congress to do something. Mm-hmm. And if we have to do it in pieces with a worker program and then look at documentation and then lead to comprehensive reform, great. Let's just take those steps. But we've been pushing for a long time to equalize that whole labor situation. And we've realized that, we're not getting anywhere right now. And we haven't in the past administrations, even when we had support in Congress on the Democratic level who were looking at this, still couldn't get it done. So it's not just a bipartisan issue. And we realize it's tough because the Midwest doesn't get it at all. Mm-hmm. But we've been pushing as an organization for many years. And we as a county farm bureau, support that and have participated in that coalition for a long time. All right.
And I think we got time for one more thing. Tell us about the 100-year anniversary that you guys are going to have. When's it happening? Promote it.
Our Centennial event is September 30th. We're doing it at the Spreckles Sugar Barn, which is on the Tenamore and Antle property in Spreckles. It's an evening event from 5 p.m. to 9 p.m. It's going to be more of a strolling dinner social event with entertainment and dancing. We're going to have some wine tasting and some very interesting food. We're planning some great things there. And then also some demonstrations or vignettes, so to speak, of equipment through those 100 years divided into quarter centuries. And so we'll have some things parked around that people can look at and see, oh yeah, we've come a long way since 1917. So yeah, so we're excited, and tickets are on sale at our website, which is Monterey CFB as in countyfarmbureau.com.
Excellent.
Awesome.
Excellent.
And what's the California Farm Bureau website?
That is, you're going to put me on the spot here. Yeah, if you just do California Farm Bureau, if you Google it, it'll come up. So I'm not sure exactly, because it's a bookend or a bookmark on one of my my browsers, so I don't even really look at the URL that much. So, but yeah, California Farm Bureau has a lot of information about issues too, and is heavily involved in that. And our website too provides a lot of information about the issues going on locally here. Mm-hmm. We try and aim it partially to the consumer, partially to the farmer. So we cover a broad spectrum of the different issues, and we try and keep it topical.
Awesome. Well, Norm, I definitely appreciate your time. This has been fantastic. It's really cool to have the conversation of cannabis now be with ag and just be accepted and not be hidden anymore. So thank you so much for your time.
Absolutely. This is a great conversation. Thank you.
Wonderful, man. Thank you.
All right. That's it for this episode. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and we'll be talking to you soon.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the $1 Pound Podcast with your hosts, Ryan and Joey, online at $1pound.com. We'll catch you next time.